With the lesson of 2 Timothy aside, these are pretty difficult and grim lessons this morning. No matter how pretty the choir was, it doesn't take the sting out of, O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy the one who pays you back for what you have done to us. Happy shall he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. It's tough stuff. And Lamentations and this psalm reflect an historical occurrence in 587 BCE. And I'm basically preaching two sermonettes this morning, one on these two lessons and one on the gospel. In 587, for a variety of reasons, partly God's hand was in it, partly because the Babylonians were the most powerful empire in the world, Babylon came up to Jerusalem and Judah and besieged it in 588. And after a year's siege that was very brutal, they took the city, they destroyed it, they destroyed the temple of God, and took the most powerful people into exile. And the response was visceral, as this psalm tells us. And it's the response that most of us have when we and ours are deeply wounded. I wanted to put this into a modern context. Pretend that some foreign enemy has besieged Charlotte. Cannon fire, the whole business, burned down every church in the city, taken the women they wanted, perhaps your wife, for their own, sold the children into slavery, and took the mayor out of the city and killed all his children in front of him and put his eyes out, which they did to King Zedekiah in the real story, and took the major portion of the important people and took them hundreds of miles away into Babylon, or we'll call it Babylon. What would your response be, your first gut response? And I think it would be something along the order of, happy shall they who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. It's our human nature. I'm amazed when people don't respond that way. We were talking in Bible study this Wednesday, I think it was in Bible study, about how amazed we were when Dylan Roof shot up Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, and their first impulse wasn't vengeance, it was to forgive the man. It's something that is only given by grace. Only God gives us the grace to do such a thing. And the beauty of the Psalms, and this is the sort of the point I'm trying to get to, is it embodies every human emotion possible. It's the songbook of Israel, and it embodies great human emotions and great human aspirations, and it embodies the worst of us and everything in the middle. And we pray the Psalms to remind us who we are. Now to the gospel. This gospel is an interesting gospel. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the gospels were written before I talk about it itself. Evidently, as best we can tell, and most of this comes from a scholar named James Dunn, who I like very much. His books are exceedingly long. I don't recommend you pick one up and read it. But he points out that the sayings of Jesus and the doings of Jesus were collected orally in churches and passed and used in the Eucharist to tell us stories about Jesus. But the context was lost about when he said it, where he was when he said it, things like that for most of them. Some of them we still have the context, the historical context or the geographical context. And 40 or 50 years later, as the apostles were dying and they were running the risk of losing these stories, they wrote the Gospels. And all the Gospels are anonymous, except for the fourth Gospel. It talks about the beloved disciple. Whoever that was is the source of it. And they strung the teachings and doings of Jesus together in a coherent story that would make sense to the churches to be read in the churches. Sometimes they organized the teachings of Jesus topically, like the Sermon on the Mount. But all the teachings in the Sermon on the Mount in Luke are spread out all through his gospel. So we've lost the original context of where Jesus said and what Jesus did historically, but we've got the content of it. And one of the things that Dunn points out is oral communication is tenacious in its keeping of the main topic of a story or a teaching, but the details get fuzzy. Last week, if you say morning and evening prayer or read forward day by day, the gospel for one of the days was a centurion whose servant or child, depending on how you translate the word pais in Greek, was deathly ill. and the centurion in one version of the gospel, the one we read, and the Jewish leaders in another gospel, and then others in another gospel come to Jesus and say, this man is worthy of your healing his son or his slave, depending on how you read the word pais. And it tells the same story, but the details are a little different. Remember the story where they lower the man down through the roof for Jesus to heal? It's interesting. In Matthew and Mark, they dig through a thatch roof to lower him down. In Luke's gospel, it's hidden in the English translation. They dig up a terracotta roof. Because for whoever Luke was writing to, their roofs were made out of terracotta, and it would not make sense to have a thatched roof. So he simply changed it to fit the story and fit the context. And the stories, our two gospel lessons are plugged together for reasons we don't know why. We're not sure why they put them together. And the first one about prayer, it says, increase our faith, says the disciples. And Jesus says, if you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you could take this mulberry tree and have it move into the ocean or the water. And this is another case of the exaggeration of the Middle East. I don't think Jesus really wanted us to be moving trees into the water. But it's about the power of prayer. That even with a little bit of faith, prayer is a powerful thing for us. And it connects us with our Heavenly Father, who in another gospel passage says, he already knows what we need before we ask. And our collect summed it up that it gives us what we need, regardless of our inability to know what we need and our unworthiness in asking. He gives us. But the second half of it is a tougher lesson. It is for me anyway. Who among you would say to your slave who has come in from plowing or tending sheep in the field, come here at once and take your place at table? Would you not rather say to him, prepare supper for me, put your apron on, and serve me while I eat and drink, and later you may eat and drink? Do you thank the slave for doing what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all you were ordered to do, say, we are worthless slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done. The last part of that pushes my buttons. It pushes my ego, which is my false self, as Thomas Merton points out. And I'm going to talk about that later, but I want to talk about using the image of slavery. The history of slavery in America is so ugly that the use of slavery in the teaching of Jesus and in the teaching of Paul is difficult to wrestle with. They use the image constantly of how we are to behave. And it's interesting, I read one of Howard Thurman's, a black writer's books, about 9 months ago. And his grandmother had been a slave. And she refused to listen when St. Paul was written because the masters and the overseers and the preachers read from Paul about slaves submitting to their masters. And she did not listen when Paul was read because she did not want to hear it again once she was free. And I wonder how she would have approached this passage where we are called to say we are worthless slaves. We've done only what we should have done. It's easy for white people to approach this. I suspect it's a lot harder for folks who are black. But I'd like to soften this passage a little bit, and I think it's worth doing, where it says we are worthless slaves. The Greek word behind it can mean worthless, but it can also mean the word mere, as in just ordinary slaves. And I would offer that that's a better translation, that we are mere slaves We have done only what we ought to have done. There's nothing in this passage that says that anybody's worthless, except in this very translation of this word. And I think it's a bad translation. Having said all that, what do we do with this? And I want to tell a story on myself to illustrate what I think Jesus is pushing up against, an attitude that I did not know I had until I spoke to God what I said, which I'm going to narrate. And it has to do with my grandson, who's 11 years old, my firstborn grandchild, Edward James Mills V. He's my namesake. And when he was first born, everything seemed fantastic. He had all his fingers and toes, and everything was great. After several months, he started missing all his developmental markers, and something became apparent that was clear, that something was wrong. And I was retired by this time, and I got to go stay with my son and daughter-in-law while they had a long, probably 2-week stay in the hospital with Quinn at Duke. And they discovered that he has a rare genetic deformation that leaves him unable, he's 11 now, he cannot walk, he cannot crawl, he cannot talk. He's fed through a JG tube because he can't swallow and eat. He had cataracts, what they fixed. At first, I thought he was just blind, and that would have been enough, but I was okay with that. I think Deb was with me when we discovered that he couldn't see. And I had a God crisis over this. I had ushered people as a priest through horrendous things. But when it's your own flesh and blood, it's different. And in the midst of my God crisis, I was working a happening weekend, which is a cursillo, for lack of a better word, for teenagers. And I had a moment alone, and I puffed my chest up and said to God, after all I've done for you, you do this to me? And I realized how stupid it was as soon as I said it. First of all, God hadn't done a thing to me. And I don't think God did anything to Quinn. I think it was a genetic fluke. It was a random act of nature that had nothing to do with anyone or God himself. It just happened. But the worst part of what I said was, after all I've done for you, if I had been in my right mind, and I can now say in my right mind, after all you've done for me, thank you for giving us Quinn to love. Because he is a life worth living. I sat and watched him sit in his mother's lap the last time I was in Durham visiting them, and she said, touch my ear. He reached up and touched her ear. He said, touch my nose. He reached up and touched her nose. She said, touch my hair. He reached up and touched her hair. So there's someone inside there, and he has a personality to him. And it's not what I would have wanted for a grandson, but he's exactly the one I love as my grandson. And it's that attitude that I think Jesus is pushing up against after all I've done for you, as if God ought to be happy to have us on his side. And I think that's what Jesus is saying when he says, when we are done, say we are mere slaves, we have done only what we ought to have done. We are broken, sinful, fallible people who are beloved of God, who are children of God by virtue of our baptism. It's not our doing, it's his gift, pure and simple, from beginning to end, from baptism to death to resurrection. It's God's gift to us. Finally, a final word about this whole image of slavery. Jesus uses it a lot. Paul uses it a lot. And both of them use it as another term for discipleship. And what they tell us, if you listen to them carefully, is by becoming slaves, we actually become free. Because God sets us free if we will serve his will instead of our will. It takes a horrific institution of slavery that's still practiced. There may be more slaves today in the world than there were in southern United States in 1860. But this slavery is a slavery that sets us free.